Welcome to Messy Liberation, the podcast that dives deep into feminism, business, and personal growth. I'm Becky Mollenkamp.
And I'm Taina Brown. Get ready for another messy conversation through the eyes of two intersectional feminist coaches.
Let's get messy. Good morning.
Morning.
Or afternoon, evening, depending on when people are listening. But I'm saying good morning to you, Taina, because it is early when we're recording this. How are you today?
It is early. I'm okay. I haven't been sleeping well, but whatever. That's par for the course. So
yeah. Well, on a future episode, I think we should talk about perimenopause because more than likely that's part of what's going on for you. It's definitely what's going on for me. And I am going today to find out about possibly going on to hormone replacement therapy, which is something I never thought I would do. So
gender affirming care, what?
I know, before it's illegal for me too.
Yeah.
It's so ridiculous. Anyway. Yes, that, by the way, anyone who's on hormone replacement therapy, HRT for your perimenopause, or for men also who do the same thing as they age, they go on to testosterone. All of that is gender affirming care. Okay. But that's what, I don't think we're talking about that today, even though I could talk about perimenopause for days at this point. But I thought it might be interesting to talk about Signal and the hubris of white men, which also relates into an article that I had just sent you that ran in Cosmo, that just came out in Cosmo as we're recording this. And I'm happy I'll put it in the show notes for people, talking about it's called The Great Feminism Recession. The backlash to gender equality is here, but why? And it's based on this study. The study is probably more important to look at because if you look at the study, it starts to change a bit it's interesting to look at the framing of the article. But I think that things can be a bit related because white men, specifically white men, are just a reminder again.
Worst. Not all. Obviously, we know that.
You know what? We could do a little conversation about not all being anything, right? Because as soon as we have to give the caveat, not all men, not all white men, not whatever, that is the same as the all lives matter stuff. I know you know this, but I'm saying this is the white person in the room to like drive it home for people. Men, if you claim to be a feminist, if you claim to be an ally to women, you cannot get your panties in a bunch when someone says all men suck or men are bad, or even if they don't use all men, just men suck. Men are the worst. Do not come at me with a not all men, because until it is not all men, it's all men. And you are the ones who need to call them in and fix your brothers, not us.
Yeah.
I could rant on that too.
Yeah.
But I figured we could talk about this study a little bit and then also kind of bring in how that relates to the ridiculous story that's happening as we're recording this. Who knows, by the time this airs on Monday, only a few days later, who knows where we'll be. But at the moment, these top brass folks, including the vice president of the United States, went into a Signal chat to talk about war plans, to talk about military maneuvers in foreign countries in a encrypted but still private company, not government, not SCIF, public app that anyone, including you and I, use to have conversations. And they brought a journalist into the conversation because they're
accidentally.
Either accidentally or not accidentally. Either way, it was stupid. But I think it speaks to this hubris of white men, this overconfidence, because now they've said it's not real. It didn't happen. It's a journalist's fault. It wasn't really sensitive data. And then immediately
so they're gaslighting.
Right. And then the person comes and they're gaslighting another white man, which is hilarious. But, and then they've come out now with even more receipts to show, oh, don't play me, because look, I'll show you the entire conversation, which includes all of the actual detailed times, locations, military weapons, everything that you guys talked about. And then today, the press secretary, that wonderful lady, came out and said the whole story's a hoax. Like, I can literally see it in front of my eyes, and it's a hoax.
She said it's a hoax? That's what they're going with?
They're going with hoax. It's worked. Why wouldn't you? It's worked for them. That's Trump's go-to, right?
Wow.
You just like lie. And then what happens?
Yeah,
he's learned.
No
I think he's learned in his life, which I think a lot of men learn in their life, that if they
can just get away with it. Yeah.
Yeah, it works for them. Why change it?
If you deny it long enough, eventually the other person will get tired of
Yeah. Or again, the
trying to
gaslighting.
prove
If you
it.
tell me what I see isn't real, eventually you wear me down. Because how do you have a conversation with somebody who's saying, like, you can say to them, here is this thing. And they say, I don't see that thing. But I'm showing you the thing. There's no thing. What
I
are you
don't
talking
see it.
about?
Yeah. Yeah.
Eventually
Yeah.
you're like,
What do
I'm
you do?
talking
You
to
can't do anything. Yeah.
yeah.
You
And
can't
it
do anything.
works and it's terrifying to see it at that, to see what has happened when we allow white male ego, fragility, hubris, this
Yeah.
unearned confidence, when we let it go unchecked to the point of it now being the most important seat in the entire world. And it is terrifying because everything we thought would happen is happening.
Yeah.
No one
Yeah.
thought this person was qualified to be Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
And here he is.
I was talking with a friend last night, a really good friend, a best friend, one of my besties, who was in the military for some years. And we were just talking about the process of getting security clearance when you are in the military or become like a government official, and how we're pretty convinced that like these people could not pass a security clearance process. And actually, I remember the first time Trump was elected, I was living in California and I was working with this or for this research company that researches neurological conditions. And so we handled brains of deceased people who had neurological conditions. But the office was on the VA campus in LA. And because it was on the VA campus in LA, I had to go through a security clearance process. And it took forever. And I had to, I don't know if you've ever like worked somewhere where you have to, like if you've ever done any kind of like research or anything like that, there's like these like self-paced courses that you have to take to like get, I forgot
Sure.
what it's called. Yeah, where you get like certified as like in terms of like ethics, when it comes to like ethics in research and ethics in
Any parent,
government property.
for parents who are listening, anytime you've been a volunteer at your kid's school or for a sports team or anything, they make you go through those kinds of things where you like show that you have listened and the
Yeah.
rules around like how to being a mandatory reporter or what it looks like if
Yeah.
somebody's
Yeah. Yeah.
bullying somebody,
Yeah.
whatever, those kinds of, and I think anybody in the workplace often does those for things like sexual harassment.
Yeah. Yeah. So the ones that I had to do were in terms of like ethics in government, ethics in research, things like that, which are like a little bit more intense. And so, um, and I remember as I was going through like the videos and like the quizzes and stuff, I just very clearly remember like getting asked a question that Trump had just failed. Like he had just done the opposite of what I was being told I needed to do, as even though I wasn't working for the government, because it was on government property, I was considered a government employee, which is a weird thing, but he had just done the opposite of what this ethics in government video was telling me I needed to do. And I'm like, how, like, what, what universe are we in right now? Like, he's on a completely alternate timeline from the rest of us because the ways that we have been taught and mandated to function apply to him and his goons, they're like the mafia. Like they're like the mafia running the fucking government. And you know, historically the president of the seat of the president of the United States has been the most powerful position in the world, but I'm at the point I'm like, what if it isn't? Like what if
Well,
it's
I think it's
not?
quickly becoming not, because the rest
Yeah.
of the world is going like, this mockery that you all are
Yeah.
engaging in has gone too far.
Yeah.
American folks, I think a good portion of us also agree it's gone too far. But sadly, this election has happened. And I think the rest of the world's saying this is ridiculous. I think the
Yeah.
rules thing is so interesting because what it makes me think, like, who writes the rules and who are the rules for, right? Historically. And the rules have been written by white men for everyone else. And I think white men learn that that's the case, right? That
Yeah.
these are
Yeah.
rules for other people. And I get to decide whether I abide by them, but I'm the one who sets them. I'm not the one who has to follow them. They're meant for everyone else.
Yeah.
So anyone who's not a white man learns very early on the
You
rules
have no
matter.
choice. Yeah.
Right. You
You have
have to
no
follow these
choice to
rules.
follow the rules. But if you're a white
Right.
man, you choose to follow the rules, but you
Right.
can also choose not to.
And if you don't, the consequences often are not much.
Yeah.
Whereas if you are a woman, if you're a person of color, you learn early on the consequences can be deadly, right? The consequences of not following the rules set by the white man can lead to your death.
Yeah.
So, of course, you learn from an early age that rules really matter and that we have to follow the
Mm-hmm.
rules and we have to be careful. We've got to be really serious about this. And white men are more like, rules are meant to be broken.
The
What's going to
rules,
happen?
schmoles.
Right, ask for forgiveness and like all of that stuff. And this is what happens then when we get to this place is the people who are setting the rules once again don't believe the rules apply to them. And so then when they get called on it, the answer is like, I honestly feel like there's probably they're sitting there going like, wait a minute, like why do they get, who are they to call me out
Mm-hmm.
on this, right?
Mm-hmm.
How dare they? Like, these rules don't apply to me. They apply to Hillary and her emails, but they don't apply to
Yeah.
me. They apply to Obama and his stuff, not to me. Don't they
Yeah.
see me? Don't they see I'm a white man? Like, this isn't me.
Yeah.
And so it's just so interesting to watch. I feel like they're almost like deer caught in the headlights. Like, wait a minute, what do you mean? We don't have to follow the rules. Haven't we established that at this point? And then the answer is just like, well, then I guess we'll just say that's not real because it's worked in the
Yeah.
past. It's just so interesting to see. Like, I feel like this moment is such a like microcosm of the bigger issue of what happens in white supremacist patriarchal systems where white
Yeah, it's
men,
definitely on display. It's
yeah,
like playing out in a very real and public way. We're usually in a very institutionalized way, where I think for a lot of people, the way that they usually see this play out feels interpersonal,
right.
right? And I think for decades, feminists, Black feminists, people from the queer community, right? The quote unquote woke mob, we've been saying this isn't an interpersonal issue. This is an institutional issue. These are systemic issues that are embedded in our institutions. And it feels interpersonal because we are people, we are interpersonal people, but it's bigger than that. And we are finally seeing it play out on the biggest institutional stage where I mean, technically, it's been playing out at this institutional level for a long time, just not in such a public way. And now it's like, it's not just on public display, it's giving itself a parade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is the interpersonal thing because I think for so many folks, for folks who are not white men, and that is the bulk of people who voted against Trump were not white men. White women
Mm-hmm.
voted far too much for him, obviously. But I mean, his largest base is white men by far. Like they vote overwhelmingly for him, others vote against him. And I think it's because folks who are not white men, so many of us have that experience of being in a relationship, whether it's a partner or a boss, but in a relationship where you recognize that abusive behavior, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we can see it because we're like, I know this behavior. I've experienced this before. I know what it's like to be with a narcissist or a sociopath or a person who lacks empathy and care and like and then turns it on me, right? And
Yeah.
that's what I'm seeing happening now. Faith Clark shared an article with me that I thought was really interesting, and I'll link it in here too, that just came out, I guess, a couple days ago called When Your Abuser is Your President, and
Hmm.
talking about like there's a reason why we're all feeling this because we're in an abusive relationship with our president, right? And we all recognize these symptoms from having been in relationships in other places with the same sort of narcissist, psychopath kind of person. And it's hard. Like those are hard relationships to leave. And then when
Yeah.
you have a person at this level, and then they say to you, "Nope, none of that's real. What you're seeing isn't real. Don't mind any of this. It's not real." You're like, in a relationship, maybe I have the option to leave. I don't even have an option to exit out of this. Like there
Yeah.
is no like I opt out. You're stuck in it and
Yeah.
just and it's crazy making. And I don't use that
Mm-hmm.
term in a derogatory like it literally is enough to start to make you feel like you're losing your
Going
mind.
crazy. Yeah. Yeah.
It's scary. Well, and maybe we can talk about this other article then, because I think it's somewhat I think it's somewhat related, because this article was a study. There was a study, and I saw the Cosmo article about it, but there's a study that was done globally, and there were something like 24,000 people. So it's a huge sample of people. I think it's important to note that it's not a huge sample of people from a singular country where there may be more norms around like the cultural concepts of an issue. So we're talking the bulk of the people, like 24 out of the 25,000 or whatever, came from Canada, Ireland, the US. Those seem maybe somewhat similar in that they're Eurocentric kind of countries, and New Zealand and South Africa, which are colonizer countries as well, but then also Turkey and Malaysia, which have very different kinds of histories than those other colonizer kind of countries. So
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. I don't know what that does to the data, but I'll just share a little bit about the data. This is talking about what the different generations feel about gender equity or gender equality, male and female. So baby boomer men, baby boomer women, Gen X men, Gen X women, millennial men, millennial women, and Gen Z men and women. Those are the 4 generations covered by this study of 24,000 people. And what they found is there is this growing divide that has been happening, or that is present as you get younger. So baby boomers, men and women, actually are the most similar in their beliefs about gender equity and equality. And Gen Z are the most divided, right? They have the biggest gaps between their beliefs around these issues.
Okay.
So younger folks right now have a bigger, women believe that they are more likely to call themselves feminists than men. That is true across all generations, but the divide between in Gen X or Gen Z is much higher than in others. So Gen Z women are more likely to call themselves feminists than Gen Z men, who are less. They're as like unlikely as any other decade or generation. Some of the other questions they ask, the one that really gets me too, is men are being expected to do too much to support equality, and that goes as you get younger. That number goes up among men. So Gen Z men, 60% of Gen Z men answered yes to that question. Men are being expected to do too much to support gender equality, where 44% of baby boomer men did. And with women, it's almost
Interesting.
all in the 30s. Yeah, and there's a couple other questions there, but I think that one is here. I guess the other one that's really interesting and relevant is we have gone so far in promoting women's equality that we are now discriminating against men. And the answers to that question were, again, baby boomers up to Gen Z, and Gen Z, it was 57%. So almost 60% of Gen Z men said yes, while only 38% of Gen Z females said yes, and only 29% of baby boomers. What I thought was really interesting too was finding out how baby boomers are responding to these questions, that the men and women in baby boomer generation are so much more aligned, and we're answering in ways that were way more feminist than the other generations. And the worst generation was Gen X, my generation, which is embarrassing. So I think I may just continue to call myself an elder millennial, even though I am technically Gen X, because it's embarrassing. But I think it's interesting looking at this and seeing that while we see in the US, in our politics, these disparities, this obvious glaring problem that we have with sexism and racism in our country on display in this moment of like white men just not getting it. Men still think, younger men are getting brainwashed by the Joe Rogans of the world, I suppose, the Andrew Tates of the world, to believe that men are the ones being discriminated against. Men are being expected to do too much to bring about equality. Feminism is a bad thing. And I just think that that's really sad and interesting. I don't know.
Yeah.
When you looked over it, did anything come up for you?
Yeah. So when you first sent me the article, I had like an internal eye roll, not at you, but at the article. Because I was just
No, for
like,
sure.
I'm so tired of these conversations. I'm so tired of this like take of, is feminism dead? Have feminists gone too far? Like that's not new. That take is not new at
No.
all. And
It's been
I think,
happening generation. I mean, I'm sure
yes,
you remember it with
absolutely.
I remember the 90s. At each wave of feminism, there's this like,
Right.
oh, feminism's dead. So
Right.
I totally
Right.
agree.
And the results of the study, I think, validate that, right? Like across generations, the divide obviously varies by generation, but like this whole conversation about, is feminism dead? Is it creating more harm than good? Like that conversation has been around since before feminism was even a word. I think having that conversation, one, is a distraction from like what the real issues are, and two, like it misses the point. Like I think the real question is not, is feminism dead or has feminism gone too far? I think the real question is like, how is feminism adapted? Like how do we adapt feminism to meet the needs of all the people in these different generations? Because every generation grew up in a different kind of culture. Like that's legit. There's nothing wrong in saying that, but that's not where we end that conversation. Where that conversation ends is when we've interrogated those very specific generational cultures and said, okay, how has that affected the way that people think about not just gender roles, but the world in general? And how do we then have a conversation with people who think that way about how to have a more equitable world? I'm just, I think articles like that are right up there with like clickbait for me,
For
because
sure.
it's just like, look at this like controversial take. It's like when you get on social media and it's like hot take or controversial opinion, and then it's like you hear what the person has to say and you're like, that's not controversial at all. Like that's not
Right.
a hot take. Like I remember once
Hot takes suck.
right. Like I remember, so I think I may have mentioned this before, where some Gen Z influencer was like, adulting hack, have more than one set of bed sheets. That way, when you do laundry, you don't have to wait to put your bed sheets back on the bed. And I was like, that's a hack? That's not a hack. That's normal.
Right?
So it's the same, like it elicits the same response out of me. It's like, this isn't controversial to me.
Yeah. Well, and it's disappointing to see Cosmo, not that I think highly of Cosmo at all, but a publication for women to even frame, because when you look at the study, there, because I had a conversation about this with Faith Clark as well. So I want to credit her in some of my thinking here, but it's just so interesting because you could frame that study in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
What I would see when I say that study is, holy moly, men have a long way to go to catch up to their understanding of the realities of life for women, right? Because when twice as many men as women are answering questions that way, that doesn't mean feminism has gone too far, right? It means that there's clearly a divide, and women are saying, hey, we don't think so. And we're the ones affected
Yeah.
here. And
Yeah.
men are saying, we
Yeah.
don't care what you think, right? And so I think there was a lot of ways you could have framed that. And for them to talk about, to frame it as a backlash to gender equality and asking the question, is feminism out of favor with women, is a really interesting way of framing this
Yeah.
study, especially for a publication that's meant for women, right?
Yeah.
Like I might expect that sort of framing from the Charlie
Men's
Kirks and
health.
Andrew Tates
Yeah.
and or even Men's Health, right? But it's upsetting when you see it in a women's magazine. And I also think, going just to the study, because I think the study in and of itself is interesting, and I am interested to know, because I think we need to know if young men are feeling this way, what's happening, what's causing that, right? I think that is important information. But I also think, as Faith had mentioned too, it's just the framing of the questions, right? Because when we talk about the framing of the questions, that starts to change things. I find myself as a feminist, but there's no explanation of what that means. What if you had asked, I believe that all men and women should have equal rights
Right.
under the law?
Right.
Would that have elicited different responses than I define myself as a feminist? The idea of, have we gone so far in promoting women's equality that we're now discriminating against men? Could it have been that historically we've done so little to promote equality among women that now that we are, men are feeling the pinch of that, or they're feeling
Right.
a loss of
Right.
privilege, right? Because that's what that question means, but that's not how it's asked. So each of
Yeah.
these questions could have been asked in a way that was feminist, and would have received different answers, I suspect. And so I do think that that's really interesting.
Yeah,
Well,
I think
does that bring anything up for you before I go on to
no, I
another
think
thing?
that brings up, that's a really important point because it brings up this idea of like data literacy and ethics in survey collection and ethics in data collection, and research studies, which I mean, that's what my wife does. And so we are constantly having conversations about just like, look at this ridiculous question. Like, why would you ask a question this way? One, it's leading, or it's a leading question, or it's not really getting to the point. Like, the answer that you would get with this question is not really the kind of information that you're looking for. Also, even like when I'm putting together like feedback surveys for like clients and stuff like that, I always run that shit by my wife because I'm just like, what's the best way to ask this question in order to get the information that I'm looking for, right? That's going to be useful for me. But then once you have the data can be manipulated. One, how you collect the data, there's always going to be a bias there.
Right. Well,
And
as I
one
mentioned,
thing,
these countries are not all the same, right? And so
right,
to throw Malaysia in with the US and then make it look as if this is
if it's on the
representative,
same, yeah, it's different because
right?
there are
There's
cultural differences.
major cultural differences. And then
Yeah.
how useful is the data to draw these
Yeah.
big conclusions that globally now we're saying feminism's dead?
Yeah, yeah. And so one thing, like one example that I use a lot when I'm doing like Women's History Month presentations is, which is, it is Women's History Month now in March, is the statistic to illustrate the need for something like data literacy and what data literacy, how we can expand our concept of the data that's been collected, is that statistic that people like to throw around during Women's History Month about how women only make 68 cents or 80 cents to every man's dollar. And it's like, okay, that statistic is not true, but it's not the whole truth, right? If you break it down even more, like you see that Asian women make the highest rate per dollar compared to women. And then it's white women, and then it's Black women, and then Latina women, and then Indigenous women, right? And so there's more nuance to be discovered, or to be not discovered, but to be uncovered when you're doing research, when you're doing data collection, that if you don't really ask the right questions, you miss out on that nuance, you miss out on that complexity. Then when you're giving the data, when you're showing the data to people, it becomes this prescriptive mode for things like policy, for things like nonprofits, the way that they organize and the way that they work, that is not really, it's not really hitting the mark where it needs to hit the mark because the data hasn't been informed enough to actually target the real issue that they're trying to target. And so data
Well, that
literacy is, it's such a big issue.
it is. And that specific stat, it's really interesting too, because then it's the framing of the statistics, right? Because when we hear that stat, what you hear almost every time is women earn 73 cents on the dollar. Well, interestingly, which group of those women that you mentioned are the ones that make 73 cents on the dollar? It's the white women. We could just as easily say women make 90 cents on the dollar, or whatever it is that Asian women make. I believe it's somewhere around.
Mm-hmm.
Or we could just as easily say women make 56 cents on the dollar, which is, I think, what the Indigenous women, the lowest end of that is.
Yeah, yeah.
But the one number that
But the
gets thrown around as
priority is on the white
universal
women.
number, right, is the
Yeah,
white women. And that happens again and again in studies where the number that's pulled out as if it is the number or the standard or the average is actually just whatever is representative of the people that are that the framers of the story care about,
yeah, yeah,
which is generally going to be white men, white women, right? And so that is important because when we talk about these things, just the way we talk about it and the way
yeah,
it's framed, but and as you said, it becomes this thing that we take as like gospel, and it's
yeah,
not
yeah.
true. And yes, white women do earn 73 cents on the dollar, but that is not
That's not the whole
gospel.
story. That's
It's
not
not
the
even
whole
close to the whole
story.
story. Yeah.
And even to break down the nuance even more, like when you're comparing white women to Asian women to Black women to Latino women to Indigenous women, like you're talking about, you're mixing race and ethnicities in there. Like
Hmm.
Latina is an ethnicity, it's not a
Right.
race. So
You can be
you
a
can't
Black
really
Latina,
compare it. Right. You could
right?
be a Black Latina, you could be an Asian
Right.
Latina, you could be an indigenous Latina, you could be a white Latina. So it's not even that, like breaking it down by quote unquote race is not really getting to the heart of the issue.
The only thing that that does is illustrate just how, I don't want to say ridiculous, nonsensical, because it's race is one of those things, and gender are these things that are absolutely not real and 100% real, right?
Yeah.
They are
Yeah.
constructs that matter. But also, when you start to look at them too closely, you start to realize how quickly they break down because they are
Yeah.
just constructs. And so
Yeah.
and that's one of those places that illustrates that. And having these conversations doesn't have that kind of, generally when we're trying to, especially when you're trying to talk about data, which you're trying to make something that can't be hard and fast, black and white, it's this
Hmm.
or that, trying to turn it into a solid number of just like, well,
Yeah.
this is what, like even this study, this talks about men and women. What about folks who are gender non-binary,
Right.
right? Or gender
Right.
expansive? Like that information doesn't get put in here. And then so they're either being lumped in or excluded. Well, what maybe that would have changed the data,
Right.
so
Right.
it's everything. Who's deciding to do the questions? How are they creating the questions? Who are they asking? How are they categorizing the data they receive
Yeah.
back? How are they reporting that data? And then all the way to where, like Cosmo, how are they framing the data? And I think, data literacy and also media literacy, which we've talked about before, we have to become educated consumers of this information. And when I saw this, it was like my initial reaction was yours too, which is just like, oh my God, at 50, I have heard this same story now
For
every decade.
50 years.
Yeah, I mean, there's every year there's a story coming out, and certainly
Yeah.
every generation, here it is again, feminism's dead. And I think what
Yeah.
they really mean is, when has feminism gone too far, to your point earlier, is what I think when I hear that, what I feel in my bones is, have women gone too far?
Yeah.
As in,
Yeah.
chill out, ladies. We've given you enough. Right. And so
Yeah.
it only makes me
Yeah.
more angry. And then when I see the answers coming back in this way, where men are saying yes and women are saying no, it just reaffirms for me that that's exactly what's happening each time these
Yeah.
sort of things come out. It is
Yeah.
men reminding us, hey, we're willing to tolerate so much of this, and then it's enough. Right.
Yeah. Pull
You
it back
only
a
get
bit.
what we deem enough. And we're saying, slow down. Right?
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
feeling I
Yeah.
get when I see this sort of thing. And
Yeah.
what makes me angry wasn't so much the study as the framing of it.
Yeah.
Frame it that
Yeah.
way.
Which I think you brought up two really important points, right? Because it's like, I think the other thing is like language, especially loaded terms that are in the popular lexicon of, of the way people understand the world around them, like feminism and race and gender. Like those mean different things to different people. And so when you are doing research like this, when you're talking about these kinds of issues, you have to level set at the beginning to make sure everyone's on the same page. Like whenever I'm like facilitating or working with a client one-on-one and we're talking about these things, I'm like, this is what I need when I say this. Let's define these terms first so we're all on the same page. And that way, later on down the road, there's not some kind of disagreement or complication because we've been talking about different things the entire time. And then the other thing is like, where did they get their samples from? They could have gotten these samples from everyone who goes to church. They could have gotten these samples from
Joe Rogan
upper
listener.
middle class neighborhoods or lower class neighborhoods. So like that information is important to know when you're looking at data. Where did you get your samples from? Because that also gives context to the results that you get from the data. If all your interviewing or all your survey results are from a very specific group of people, then all that's telling you is that that specific group of people think that way, right? Like I think I remember, do you remember the book Grit
Mm-hmm.
by Angela Duckworth? Yeah, like a lot of people love that book. I haven't read it.
I haven't either.
So, like I don't know much about it, but I just remember like at some point someone told me that like most of the people surveyed for the results of the research of that book were like people in the military. Well, of course, people in the military have grit because that's what they're trained to do, right? So like it's important where this data is also coming from, because it contextualizes the data in a way that gives us information about where there might be bias and where there might not be bias. And so we have to know all of that as well. And without knowing that, like, how can we, you can't form an opinion really without, or you shouldn't without knowing that. Cause
Well, that is what's I think is so important, is like teaching people curiosity. And I don't think we're
yeah,
teaching people that. And then
no,
I think
no.
going back to what's happening right now with this whole I think they're calling it SignalGate, this whole thing going on is, it is clearly the response to that is stop being curious.
Yeah.
Right? But
Yeah.
stop. Don't
Stop
ask
asking questions.
questions. Yeah, just accept what we say and don't be curious. And by the way, that's what the school system's designed to do, right? That's what we teach
Yeah.
children early on. Don't ask questions, just do what I say. And it's important to ask questions. I had two final thoughts and I know we have to wrap up, but one is I just wanted to point out one other question I didn't mention because it's the one that really makes my skin crawl. It feels less important, but I just want to share it, which is, a man who stays home to look after his children is less of a man. That was the question or the statement that people had to agree or disagree
Wow.
with. So that really shows you, I think, a lot about the framing of this study to begin with, because what kind of question is that? Instead of saying a man who stays home to look after children is more of a man, that would just be one word
Yeah.
different. Or something that would be even better, which is like, a man who stays home to look after his children is contributing to his family, is supporting his wife, is, doing what women
Yeah.
have done
Yeah.
through history, and that should be validated. Like, there are a million ways to look at that, but the framing is really something. Okay.
Who
And the other
funded
thing,
this research is my question.
well, it was funded by King's Business School. I believe they're out of London. So King's College London. I don't know enough
Yeah.
about King's College to know, but obviously, and they have a Global Institute for Women's Leadership was also part of this. So
Yeah. I
interesting.
almost went to King's College.
Well, I'm glad you didn't. Their framing is really, I wonder if it comes out of the men's studies department or
Yeah.
something. But anyway, the last thing is just like, so one piece that I'm taking from what I've read here, like, listen, all of the stuff, all of the caveats of this has always been going on, that there's definitely a lot of questioning about the quality of this study and all of that. But I do see again and again, not just here, that there is this growing, what appears to be a growing discontent amongst younger men, fueled by the Andrew Tates and the Joe Rogans and the right
Mm-hmm.
wing
Mm-hmm.
pushing that like incel pipeline thing. There
Yeah.
seems to be growing discontent around women, around feminism, right? Around
Yeah.
like women's equality or equity. And the thing that I am taking from all of this is what I think we need to teach young men more, and all people, because this is also an issue around race. So it's
Yeah.
everyone too. But I feel like there's just not enough teaching people how to sit with discomfort. Because I think
Mm.
when I see all of this, what I really see is young men saying, I'm uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable with this change. My dad didn't have this. I didn't see that with my
Mm-hmm.
grandpa. Now
Mm-hmm.
you're asking me to deal with all of this change and navigate all of this stuff when I thought the world was going to look a certain way for me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
As a white man, I thought my world would look like this. And now you're asking me to adjust that to this new reality, that where I have to lose some power. I have to lose some of that privilege, where I don't get to just say the rules don't apply to me.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
inside of that is what I really hear is just discomfort, right? The same
Yeah.
discomfort that everyone else has had to navigate forever. We're
Yeah.
asking white men now to navigate some of that discomfort, and they don't know how. I don't think they have the tools to do it. That
Yeah.
doesn't excuse it. But as a parent of a young white, of a white boy who will become a white man, it is just a reminder for me to, I think it's really important to teach young white boys who will become white men how to be with discomfort, how to
Mm-hmm.
be with things when they don't go their way, when it isn't what they thought it would be, when we're asking
Mm-hmm.
them to sit with something that's really hard, showing them what it looks like to lose privilege, to lose power, to not always have it in the room. I think it's just so important for them to be with that, so that they, when someone says a man who stays home to look after his children is less of a man, the answer is an obvious, well, no, why would that matter? But I think
Yeah.
men hear that and they feel, these young men are feeling this like loss of that power they thought they are supposed to have. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
they just need to learn how to be with some of that discomfort. So I don't know. That's
Yeah.
what I was, out of all of the other stuff, like I know all the media literacy and all that, but the piece where I'm like, what can I actually learn from this and take from this
Yeah.
beyond that kind of thing? And that to me is like this critical thing that I feel like as a society, we have to figure out, how do we help?
Mm-hmm.
And I know, by the way, just before I hand it over to you, I also know it can be really hard to hear that when you are somebody who has a marginalized identity, because as a woman, there's the instinct in me, having a child has changed this a bit, but my instinct is always like, well, fuck you. I've always had to be uncomfortable. Why do I have to coddle you as you learn to be uncomfortable? So like, I get that instinct and feel that entirely. And as a mom, I also think, yeah, but if you don't learn it, how do you learn it? We do have to
Exactly.
the skill. Anyway, I don't know if anything else.
No, I 100% agree. It brings to mind, I read something a few weeks ago about, well, not read it, but saw it because I think it was on social media, but about, there's this whole like thing that they're calling like the loneliness epidemic of like young men and boys. And someone was like, it's not a loneliness epidemic, it's a skills gap. Like they haven't learned how to form platonic relationships. They haven't learned how to deal with rejection. They haven't learned how to be uncomfortable. And I think that's the root of it, right? Like the loneliness epidemic, like calling it that and focusing on the loneliness is focusing on the outcome, right? Whereas like what's the root?
The into feminism. We're focusing on the wrong things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. At some point you do have to learn those things, and sometimes you have the intuition to learn on your own, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you need someone to walk alongside you and help you learn those things. I think the real question is, are men willing to learn? Right? Like, are they willing to just be like, okay, I see this as a problem for me, which in turn becomes a problem for everyone. How do I learn these things?
Unfortunately, it seems like men aren't. Again, not all men, but men as a collective, they don't seem like they are. The times I see the exceptions are when a man finally has a daughter. It shouldn't take having a daughter for you to recognize women as full humans, but that seems to be it. By the way, you also probably had a mother or a sister or a grandmother or an aunt, or, but anyway, that is one time when it seems to, but that's why I think it's got to start young. And anyone who has kids, if you have a boy, especially if you have a white boy, but anyone with a boy, we need to teach our boys all of these skills that they haven't had to historically have. It is not baked in their bones the way it's baked in our bones, right? Through epigenetics, women learn to be afraid and follow the rules and to learn how to deal with loneliness or, we have these skills that we have to keep us alive, and men haven't had to have that. And we have to start teaching them those skills when they're boys, because we can't rely on them to willingly decide to do it when they become men. Some will, and not enough do.
But some won't. Yeah.
Well, this was thank you. It was a great conversation.
Welcome.
See you again next week. Thanks for listening to Messy Liberation.
Will you please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen?
I know people say that all the time, and if you're like me, often you just go on to the next podcast, but truly, taking that moment to do that will really help us reach a wider audience.
Thank you so much for your support and for listening today.
Until next time.